Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be discussing anti-Israel groups such as the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and also Boycott's Divestments and Sanctions. And in particular, we'll be asking what damage are they doing to Israel and the Jewish people here in Britain. We'll also be exposing a lot of their lies and false accusations in which they make against the Jewish state. These groups have largely been responsible for undermining academic freedom of expression and freedom of speech whilst trying to impose boycotts upon Israel, including trade boycotts, which having a devastating impact upon Israel's economy and also ordinary Palestinians as well. And the other issue that we're going to be discussing is why do these groups, if they claim to be supporting the Palestinians, are quiet when it comes down to the suppression of Palestinian rights in Jordan, Syria, and in Lebanon, and why are they so quiet when so many ordinary Palestinians are facing suffering and persecution in states that neighbour Israel? And this is today's programme. Joining me on today's programme is a good friend of mine, Benjamin Rubin, Middle East analyst, and Philip Lewis, who's a Christian grassroots activist. So welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Benjamin, it's always good to have you on the Middle East Report. Definitely a regular. So can you give us an update on some of the things you've been involved in the last maybe couple of months since you last been on?
In the last few months, we started working on a workshop, teaching, educating people about, as you said, effectively lies, particularly the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign are putting out there to the public. I had a close encounter. Phil and I, for a year and a half, we dealt with the PSC campaign in Covent Garden, in the Ahava campaign. I think we're going to touch a bit later. And I had many hours of conversations and experience talking directly to the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign activists, or to see their effect on the general public. We've come up with a platform that can expose those lies and perhaps mitigate the damage these people are doing. And that's what I'm currently active.
Excellent. And Philip, I first met you at the rally organised by Benjamin.
Yes.
Outside the Harvest store in Covent Garden, which is famous for producing excellent Dead Sea products, and it was to counter the Palestinian demonstrations against Israel. And I remember you, in particular, and your wife Brenda, actually bringing Welsh flags as well as Israeli flags at the stand when you're making a stand for Israel. How did you get involved in Israel, and how did the Lord touch your life concerning the importance and significance of Israel and the Jewish people and standing with them?
I suppose it goes back quite some time. I remember as I was in primary school, so I was only 8, 9 or 10, my grandfather had given me a book called The Five Chimneys. A rather unusual book because it was way beyond my years, but it was obviously about the Auschwitz death camp. That was my first recollection, The Five Chimneys. Recently, however, being a Christian and things like that, I began to realise how important Israel was. Don't know why I didn't before, but I look back at Abraham and I realised that Abraham thought from the other side of thinking. And I realised that the West is all about get in. And I realised that with the Hebraic way of thinking, it's all about give in. And that sort of started the ball rolling. And then I realised that the Israeli jigsaw piece slotted into place, and all of a sudden the scriptures began to make much more sense. I saw everything more clearly. And the world is obsessed with Israel. So I thought, obviously, there must be an importance, because hardly a day goes by without it being on the front page or as a focus on the news. And I realised that Israel sustains and enhances life. So I thought, why on earth are people so against them? I then began to realise that we've got an eternal problem here. God is the eternal God. The God of Israel is eternal. I realised that the land is eternal, because God said, I'll inhabit that land. It's my habitation. I want to be there forevermore. And I realised that the people are eternal, because this Hebraic way of thinking is an eternal way of thinking, because, as I said earlier, it's about giving. And I know when I read in the scriptures where in Samuel it says, it had pleased God to make you his people. And then the word chosen came into the picture. People say, oh, the chosen people, and it's been hanging on their neck for a long, long time, but I don't think they fully realise the significance of chosen. It's as if, oh, God selected them as favourites. Not at all. When he chose them, he rejected nobody. When he sort of said, right, I want to work with people, Abraham responded to that call. He wanted to have that mentality of give, give, giving. And I suppose God thought, I can work with this person. I can work with this mentality. And he was then, after that encounter, he was called the Hebrew, the first Hebrew. So, as I said, I began to love the Hebraic way of thinking, and that's what brought things alive to me.
Excellent. And Benjamin, I know that you've been friends with Philip for a long time, and some of the sacrifices that he would make is actually drive him and his family and friends all the way from South Wales to stand with you in opposition to the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign's boycott of the Harvest Store in central London. What does it mean for you personally and the Jewish community, knowing that there are such strong, dedicated Christians that are willing to stand by the Jewish people in their hour of need?
Phil has been for years now a source of inspiration. I don't think Phil knows it, but most of the talks and workshops I do, I mention Phil by name. And when people ask me many times what drives me, I don't mention Phil's name, but I remember coming to speak at your community in Wales and seeing you spending a weekend with Phil and his family and seeing the community touched me deeply. Because these people would go for such length to try and do good. I remember the end of the talk I gave there, a lady came to me and said, would you mind coming and speak in my community? But I can't guarantee you more than 5 people would come. Would you come all the way from London for 5 people? And I thought, I see Phil coming all the way from Wales to London on his own time again. How can I even consider refusing? And I came, and it was amazing because what they did was they've advertised for the full month this talk, and they got the biggest hall in town, and they got nearly 100 people.
Yes.
So I came for 5, but there was a decent crowd. But that's the type of inspiration Phil and his family and his community has been providing for me.
Excellent. No, it's very good actually. It's so encouraging. And Philip, I know that you've gone on a personal journey yourself and that you wanted to know the truth for yourself. So you actually visited some of these West Bank towns and cities like Jenin and Ramallah. What was your experience like when you actually visited some of these Palestinian towns?
It was fixed for me to go, and although I had an Israeli car, I had to for the day hire an Arab car. And an Israeli Arab came with me, great guy, and visited, I think it was Jenin first of all, and often ringing in my ear was the poor Palestinians. Went to Jenin and got into the centre of Jenin. We had a puncture. So fortunately there was a garage nearby, and they fixed the puncture without taking the wheel off. I thought, wow, this is great. So jacked up, puncture fixed. I think it cost about £1.50, and on the way we went. But we went into the centre of Jenin, where the so-called Jenin massacre took place, and they still refer to it as a massacre, where hundreds died, but that wasn't the case. It was 30, 34, something like that. And I noticed that I just counted about 8 rebuilds. So whereas they were saying that the whole place had been levelled, I counted 8 rebuilds. Okay, it wasn't as rich, perhaps, as Nablus or Ramallah, but certainly not poor. The people looked well. And there's like an illusion going on. For example, when people think of Israel, they imagine this huge country, where it is, in fact, it's just the size of Wales. But then, conversely, when they think of the West Bank, you think, oh, why don't these Israelis give that little bit of West Bank back to the Palestinians? The West Bank is huge. So it's as if an illusion has been created to delude people. Little Israel, little West Bank, so, little Israel when it's huge, and a little West Bank when it's huge. I think I got that wrong. it's a little Israel, which they portray as being huge, and the little West Bank. And, well, there we go. I think I didn't quite get that right, but it doesn't matter. But as I say, there's an illusion going on to delude people. And I went to the West Bank, as I went to Nablus, Ramallah and Jenin, and certainly not poor. In fact, there were, before you go into Jenin, you'll see various villas living very, very well. And in Ramallah itself, a number of the shops, they wouldn't be able to place in Paris, New York or London. So.
No, it's interesting, yeah, your perspective on that one.
Yes.
We've got a clip to go to now that actually looks at the aims and objectives of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, and this is their chief executive speaking now.
I'm a patron of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign because I think the cause of the Palestinians is one of the great causes of our times. Israel has taken Palestinian land, it destroys Palestinian homes, it's massacred Palestinians in Gaza, it's created an apartheid state, and all with impunity, all with no sanction from international law. It's broken United Nations resolutions with no consequence, and Israel seems to have friends in very high places that protects it from the consequences of its actions. I think in those circumstances civil society has to say we cannot tolerate this, and that therefore one way of doing something about it is to join campaigns like Palestinian Solidarity. It needs everyone's help, and it needs everyone's time and effort and money when the possibilities allow. So I hope you join. The Palestinian people need you.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Benjamin, we just saw in that clip there the head of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign really making false accusations against Israel, calling Israel an apartheid state, breaks international law. What is your response to some of the accusations he's just made there?
Well, it's hard to deal with the amount of, let's call it, inaccuracies this gentleman has just started. Starting with Israel have taken Palestinian land, I would challenge this person to say, when did exactly Israel invaded a single Palestinian land? If you can please tell me the date, because Palestine never existed. There was no Palestinian anthem, no Palestinian prime minister, currency, sovereign state, flag, constitution ever before. So starting with this illusion, lie, inaccuracy, saying that Israel have occupied Palestine. Continuing with Palestine, talking about an apartheid state. I've just returned from Israel where I had a small problem with my eye, and I went to a hospital in Jerusalem. It's actually, by the way, a Jewish religious hospital, and I was seen by an Arab Muslim doctor. So not only there's no segregation in treatment, there's careers open. My doctor was a Muslim Arab working in a religious, not to say that there are ministers in the government, in high court, even in the army, generals which are Arabs. But predominantly my problem is not with those inaccuracies, it's what lies behind those lies. The gentleman we just saw speaking will not speak against, for example, Palestinian parties and streams and factions like Hamas, who are talking about genocide in their constitution. We have the biggest Palestinian party called Hamas. It's also the strongest faction, military faction. In fact, it's likely to win the next election according to all polls, and it has won the previous election. And these guys have enshrined in their constitution, in Article 7, genocide, worldwide genocide of the entire Jewish people. No mention of that. No mentioning that the conflict prevails because the Palestinians' constitution of Hamas is telling that there will never be peace with Israel. No mentioning this man would say, and his movement, the movement that he is recognizing, will accept a Muslim Palestinian state, but will reject a Jewish Israeli state. So they have something, for some reason, only against Jews. They will accept a Christian state, they will accept a Muslim state, they will accept a Hindu state, but they will not accept a Jewish state. And there's no mentioning in that clip. Those things make it hard for me to sit down and speak about it quietly, because it's outrageous that such lies are allowed to be propagated.
Yeah. Absolutely. We've got another clip to go to now, and this clip is entitled "Gaza Palestinian Youth Send a Message to BDS Activists."
We as students in Palestine believe in you, but we demand more from you this year.
This year, we hope for results.
It's no longer just about student solidarity. It's about making a change.
It's about taking big, long strides towards justice, for it is about boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
This takes courage, but not as much courage as our students have to show here.
Your campus is your battlefield. Be strong.
Palestine doesn't need your aid, not to facilitate our life inside the Gaza prison.
Palestine needs political action from you.
2 years ago, University of Johannesburg cut ties with Victorian University, Tel Aviv.
South Africa is leading the way because they know what racism means. With hard work, this can happen at your university.
Apartheid was wrong then, and it's wrong now.
Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, "It can never be business as usual. Israeli universities are an intimate part of the Israeli regime, by active choice."
While Palestinians aren't able to access universities and schools, Israeli universities produce the research, technology, arguments, and leaders for maintaining the occupation.
And divestment from occupation is the best investment for Palestine. Stop contacts with Veolia, Eden Springs, OG for us.
Civil society must hold them to account, while governments do not.
As Palestinians, we deserve the same rights as anybody else.
We won't move. We'll never stop resisting.
And one day, we will return.
For the voice of justice to sing loudly over Palestine,
we need you to be part of our resistance.
Make this year not only about solidarity, but change too.
This year, we're counting on you.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Philip, we just saw in that clip, which was a very, very emotive clip used by the Boycotts, Divestments and Sanctions BDS campaign to help encourage their activists to continue to calls for trade boycotts of Israel and sanctions, etc. Now, what alarms me in that clip is the historical inaccuracies of these school children and these young people talking, because it's primarily the Israelis who actually built the Palestinian infrastructure, such as schools, roads and hospitals, and yet it's their own leadership that oppresses the ordinary Palestinians, such as those living in Gaza under Hamas, and the corruption of Mohammed Abbas and his Fatah Palestinian faction. What's your impression of that clip?
Well, as I say, it's difficult when they're lying continually. They say the truth isn't being said. I'd like to go back to the issue of a Palestinian state, because, as I say, it is an illusion. They're not honest brokers here. For example, the longest occupation, I think, is the Chinese occupation of Tibet. I think it started in 1949, and they moved people into Tibet. They forced people into Tibet, and people who had never lived there before. And similarly with Turkey and Cyprus. So they're not honest brokers. As far as Israel is concerned, it doesn't violate any international law. People ask for boycotts and this and that and the other. The co-op asked for boycotts. They have boycotted settler goods. And they wrote to me and said, well, Israel violates the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention. Now, China has certainly broken that, because it says that you should not transfer people into an area which you have occupied. Now, that doesn't apply to Israel, because there was no forcible transfer. people moved into the so-called occupied area. And secondly, the area which the Israelis occupied was under no sovereign control. So they quote that Israel is breaking this Fourth Geneva Convention. They are not. Certainly the Chinese have, and the Turks have, and the world is strangely silent. But once you... So they are liars. And it's strange enough, in Deuteronomy, in the scriptures, it says that Israel, your enemies shall be found to be liars unto thee. So they are lying. But the problem is, once you start to boycott a nation, such as, say, let's boycott settler goods, you've labelled them, and people think they must be like perhaps South Africa, apartheid South Africa. So you've demonised them. And once you say that they are occupiers, the word occupation isn't a bad word. We occupy this studio, there's nothing wrong about it. But when people think of occupation, they think of Nazi occupation. So all of a sudden you've got the settlers being like South Africa, like 30s Germany. So the whole premise of it all is founded on an inaccuracy. It's erroneous to say that they are occupiers, and therefore they shouldn't be boycotted. But once you start boycotting, that gains momentum, and as a consequence, horrible things happen to Israeli settlers, which perhaps we will speak about a little later on.
Definitely. And Benjamin, it's my impression that groups like the PSC and BDS are not so much interested in the real plight of the Palestinians, but more want to use any way and means they can to attack and demonise the State of Israel, including that of the Jewish people, and yet are silenced when it comes down to the oppression of Palestinians living in Jordan or Syria or southern Lebanon, where they're discriminated against, and that's where the real Arab apartheid's taking place. And also there's silence when the Syrian regime fires rockets and missiles into Palestinian refugee camps in Syria. Why are they not protesting against the Syrian regimes or Arab regimes? Why they're not at the embassies? Why they not say boycott Jordanian goods, Lebanese goods? And there's absolute silence. But when it comes to Israel, it's a totally different scenario.
Absolutely. It's time and again that this hypocrisy is being exposed. What bothers me most is that if you're concerned about the Palestinians and you would like to see a Palestinian improve their lifestyle, gain rights, indeed the Palestinians are not in a good position right now. And that's by the continuous state of war between Palestinian leaders and the State of Israel, where the Palestinian leaders are refusing to accept the very existence of the State of Israel. I'm concerned and bothered by the fact that they are not trying to apply any pressure on their colleagues from the Palestinian side, saying, for example, stop the talk about killing and expelling all the Jews. My family lives 30 miles from the Gaza Strip. If I open YouTube and I put Hamas there, for example, and I put the word genocide, I'll see the top leader, the spiritual leader, Mahmoud al-Zahar, saying, you are headed for annihilation, we are going to kill you, we are not less honorable than the people who exterminated you. I see those things, my family being close to Gaza Strip, getting shelled by rockets by Hamas. I'm thinking, what are they going to vote in the next elections? Are they going to vote for more compromise for the Palestinians? Are they going to vote for easing the blockade on Gaza? No, as long as this man in Gaza, Mahmoud al-Zahar, is running the show, definitely Israel is going to stand firm and not allow any progress in quality of life of Palestinians. The BDS, the PSC, they want to improve Palestinian lifestyle. You want to contribute to build trust between the communities. You truly want Palestinian rights to be fulfilled, as one of the girls over there said. I'm sure you respect the Jewish rights as well. I'm sure you understand that it comes together and one community shouldn't have rights over another community. And if you do, then please go back to your leaders and saying, stop talking about genocide, stop talking about expelling, stop talking about war. Let's sit down and speak about peace, because Israel can do everything it wants. It can pull out the settlements, it can lift out the blockade. These guys are saying it doesn't matter. They're saying, we will eliminate Israel, we will eliminate and annihilate the Jewish people. What do you want my family to do? Do you want them to relinquish control, lift the blockade, let them bring heavier missiles that can target them even more efficiently, yet the PSC and the BDS simply do not address this problem.
And Benjamin, I have to ask you, from what you've just said then, do you believe that those people that are actively involved in the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, groups like the Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions, are fully aware of the true nature of Hamas and the almost genocidal nature of Palestinian society in terms of reference to Israel and the Jewish people?
Okay, I want to take a break here. I worked with Palestinians from Gaza all through my childhood. I worked as a hand in a farm and in construction. I don't think they want to kill me and my family, but I definitely think their leaders do. And I think these people are not heard, and I think the PSC are not doing them any favors with overlooking what the leadership are saying. I don't think they're fully aware, but I think they are closing their eyes. Phil was with me in the streets of Covent Garden when I went with my iPhone and I showed them the clips of what this guy is saying. When I handed them the Hamas covenant, and they refused to read it. They said it's a lie. I said, this is not printed in Israel. This is printed in Yale University. You know, is that part of the conspiracy? Yes. They don't want to know. They don't want to listen. They would close. Their leaders told the activist not to speak to Benjamin and to Phil because we would poison their minds. I think with the leadership, not with the activists. I believe the activists really think that they are doing something right, but the leadership is aware of it. The leadership chooses to refuse racism, religious bigotry, and genocidal agenda of the leading Palestinians representations of Hamas. They are willing to accept a country which is based on discrimination against Christians and on religious bigotry, on racism, just for eliminating the Jewish state. And therefore, I do not believe that the leadership of the PSC is truly concerned with Palestinian issues. No.
And we've got a clip to go to now that looks at how groups like the BDS campaign have been very involved in silencing academic freedom of expression at universities across the country. And this is an example, this clip now, of Ishmael Khalid, who I interviewed, who is the first Israeli Bedouin diplomat at Edinburgh University, and how he was refused to speak.
Speech for the 1,500 Palestinians counting Gaza? Where's the freedom of speech for the students?
citizens of Israel. We don't discuss with the Ku Klux Klan. Why should we discuss with this thug?
Well, welcome back to the Middle East Report. As you can see in that clip, it was absolutely, truly shocking, and it just shows you how these groups like the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and groups like BDS are trying to infringe academic freedom of speech and expression. And this is happening right across our universities across the country, and really this is a bad reflection on British society. You wouldn't have a Jewish society or an Israeli society disrupting a meeting for the Palestinians in such a manner. It just wouldn't happen. But this really goes down to a threat upon our democracy and freedoms in this country. Philip, I haven't seen that clip, and I first showed it when I interviewed Ishmael Khalid, who's the first Israeli Bedouin Muslim to serve an Israeli diplomat. He was on the Middle East a couple of weeks ago, and he was shocked that he wasn't given an opportunity to tell his side. Now, what does this say about British society, but more importantly, what does this say about academia in this country, knowing that your background is as a school teacher?
I think that liars and cowards don't discuss, because once you discuss, once you get into the ring with them, you'll find what they really are like, and they will disappear. But what they do, they intimidate, they shout you down, so you don't get into the ring, you don't challenge them, because once they are challenged, you will see that they are what they are. If you challenge them, you might unearth the Palestinian National Charter of 1964. In that charter, I believe it's Article 24, it says we, the Palestinians, exercise no authority over the West Bank or Gaza. So what does that say? We say they don't exercise authority over the West Bank, but they themselves also say it in their charter, the National Charter of 1964. And I've been to various meetings, and what you cannot do is ask the third question. You can ask one question, okay. The second question they are reluctant to hear, but maybe they'll allow you, but the third question, no. And what I found is that you can always draw a straight line with two dots. It's the third question which unearths the lie, because then you'll see it's off beam and you'll see that truth is along a straight line, but the third dot is somewhere else, and you cannot have a straight line. As I say, I was in Dumfries and they put on a programme, the PSE, Occupation 101. And it was just a load of nonsense. But one thing struck me. Later on, a middle-aged lady, well-spoken, said that she had been to the West Bank. She was in an olive grove. Now, they're always in olive groves or playing cricket or going to a wedding. But she was in an olive grove and she was shot at by Israeli settlers. So I asked her there and then, have you any evidence of this? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Was it reported? Because you don't get shot at every day. And she said, that's none of your business. So whenever you ask them a direct question, they cannot answer it. And I've had this sort of time and time again when, unbelievably, even in one of the Evangelical Alliance's publication, they said, or they reported that Israeli settlers regularly shoot Palestinian children. Again, you've put the settlers into the crosshairs of hate, and that is such a dangerous place to be. And when I asked them, what evidence have you got? None whatsoever. When I read a book, Light Force, I think it was, written by Open Doors, they accused the IDF of torturing to death a 19-year-old Arab boy. And when I asked them for proof, they couldn't give me any. In fact, they couldn't even prove that that boy had ever been born. So these lies are out there. Yes, you've got the PSE, yes, you've got the BDS, and you expect it of them. But when you've got people which read the same Bible, it's a Jewish Bible about a Jewish God, and then they are also putting these lies out there, they're accusing them of shooting children, you begin to lose the will to live, because you think, how can you fight this? But it has to be fought. They're not telling the truth. And as I say, later on we'll explain more the consequences of these lies.
Yeah. And Benjamin, I mean, one of the reasons I showed that clip is something that you pointed out to me a couple of years ago. I mean, in that clip we saw at Edinburgh University, they were shouting and chanting, "Palestine will be free from the River Jordan to the sea." Now, effectively, what they're calling for is genocide, isn't it, against the Jewish state? And how in the 21st century, in 2013, at our universities, are people able to get away with chants of genocide?
I just want to say that, in my opinion, that genocide, by definition, is against the people and not against the state. And that's what makes it so different. The British government, Churchill called for the destruction of the Nazi state. And that was the right thing to do. The problem we have here is beyond a political argument. Israel is right, Israel is wrong. If indeed Israel was to blame with all of the crimes that is accused, if Israel was torturing and shooting soldiers, when somebody told me killing 10,000 Palestinian prisoners in hunger and malnutrition, you know what, I would not be defending it. But they are calling for genocide against the Jewish people. And they PSC particularly are a society, an association, an organization which is definitely not for a two-state solution, not for respect, not for peace. They hide it through ambiguous calls like Free Palestine, which is on every placard they will put on. But what is that Free Palestine? One needs to go to their emblem, to their symbol. And I hope we can see it on screen in a second.
Yeah, just say to producer we can have the PSC emblem up, so then we can actually discuss that, which will come up in a minute.
Yeah. You can see that they are talking about the entire region, which includes the West Bank, Gaza State, and the Palestinian and Israel. You can see there, you have on the right, in the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the map of the land of Israel, where you have the West Bank in yellow, in red is the Gaza Strip, and in pink is Israel. And you can see in the PSC, Palestinian Campaign emblem, which is the black circle with the red shape, when they are calling to free Palestine, they are calling for a one-state solution. They are calling for a Palestinian state to be instead of Israel, not alongside it. And they are fooling even most of the students in Edinburgh University would not be calling to eliminate another member state of the UN, a state that has been democratically voted in, the only Jewish state in the world to replace for the 22nd or 23rd Arab state and 56th Muslim state. They would not be doing that, but the PSC is misleading its own people into believing that they are for peace, they are for coexistence, when they are really quite radical.
Yeah. And Philip, I really want to bring you in here, because groups like the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign have been very successful, haven't they, in particularly closing down the anchor store of Ahava in Covent Garden that's selling Israeli beauty products, and I use a lot of their, when I do shave, some of the shaving gel, which is good, and you know, the Dead Sea mud and what have you, in which they're famous for selling. Now, isn't it sad state of affairs that this shop is now actually closed, and it's no longer in here? But also your own experiences that you were sharing with me last night, that you visited the Fogel family, and they are Jewish settlers who were murdered. Was it back in 2011? Quite horrifically. So the demonization of Jewish settlers can actually result in the death of settlers.
Yes, there are consequences to boycotting Israel. Before I go on to that, I'd just like to mention, perhaps on a lighter note, that you mentioned Edinburgh, and I know they boycotted Veolia, because the Veolia were involved in the building of the light railway system in Jerusalem. And what I noticed was the consequence to Edinburgh was that their own tramway system is messed up. It's a source of national embarrassment. And yet the light railway system in Jerusalem, which Veolia built, is a source of national pride. There are consequences. If you want to boycott Israel and you boycott Israeli goods, I would imagine by the weekend we'd be back into the dark ages. But there's a much more sinister side. And this to me is the focus of it all, and it's what I'm about, and my wife, my children and other friends in Merthyr who have helped. Yes, Harbour closed in, I believe it was 2011. The shop closed, and I look back into 1935, and the first Jewish shop closed in the West End of Berlin. I also noticed in 2011 on the streets they desecrated an Israeli flag. Go back 1935 Berlin, the swastika became the national flag of Germany. During 1935 as well, blood laws were introduced. And on the streets of London, 2011, outside the Harbour shop, they screamed, "A Harbour mud, Palestinian blood." A blood libel. So the parallels are horrible. But what was even more significant was that 1935 Germany, 2011 London, or Berlin, 1935, 2011 London, both cities were preparing for the Olympic Games. And that is the horrible parallel. So the choice is yours. You go with the cowards who shout people down. They can't answer, because you know that once you begin to question, once you begin to get to that third dot, you reveal, the mask begins to slip and you'll see what they're really like.
Yeah. And Benjamin, I know this is something that you've worked tirelessly and campaigned for, was defending the Israeli store Ahava in Covent Garden, and you give up many of your Saturdays, which is Shabbat, to actually go there and put Israel's case forward. What does it say about British society in general that a store like Ahava has been closed down?
Well, I don't think it's a source of pride. And by the way, they're now doing it to Soda Stream in Brighton, which is another very successful Israeli product, eco-friendly, and supports many Palestinians families. But I go back to your question about freedom of expression in this country. The first time I went to an pro-Israeli demonstration by the Israeli embassy, it was in 2009, and I took an Israeli flag with me. My wife told me, "You might want to put the flag in your backpack." I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, we will be at risk if the flag is shown." I didn't believe her at first until I looked right and left and I realized where I am. And I was shocked. I thought I'm coming to Europe, 21st century, where democracy, Britain, cradle of democracy for Europe. And yet I can walk with every flag, but not with an Israeli flag. I can go with the Palestinian flag. Nobody will touch me. One of my friends actually did carry an Israeli flag on him, and he was attacked.
Yes.
Physically assaulted until he had to put, had to put down the flag. Otherwise, he would not walk away from there. I think it's something very worrying that is happening here. That you have certain segment of society, generally very contributing to society, that are just being silenced.
Yeah. Okay. I want to bring you into this one, Philip. I mean, we've seen this barrage of lies, false accusations against Israel, particularly made by the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and BDS. And now this movement is penetrating the church. We have like Methodists, and also the Presbyterians are calling for boycotts against Israel. Now, surely the church needs to wake up and realise that actually our duty is to stand with Israel and the Jewish people, because we're serving a Jewish God, we're serving Yeshua HaMashiach, who's the Jewish Messiah, and yet we're turning against the people of Israel and the Jewish people. And have we not learnt the lessons of the horror of the last war, in which 6 million precious Jewish lives perished at the hands of the Nazis?
We certainly haven't learned from history. As I say, the streets of London, it was reminiscent of 35 Berlin. as I say, there are consequences, and when I've been to churches, the response hasn't been favourable. One of the consequences of putting the settlers into the crosshairs of hate was the Fogel family. I went to Itamar. I was out in Israel in 2011 March on the day of the Japanese tsunami. But later on that evening, in Itamar, a family was slaughtered. Both parents were knifed to death. The two young boys, 11 and 4, they had their throats slit. And as the two killers left this house, they heard a baby cry. They went back in and beheaded her. And the day they were being buried, on the Sunday, because they couldn't bury them on the Saturday, it was Shabbat, the day they were being buried in Ramallah, or very near to Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority rededicated a square in honour of a female suicide bomber. It's beyond description. When I came home and offered this story to various church groups, they said they were not interested. And I think after that I went into some sort of depression, because that was just an awful thing to hear. So there are consequences, but at the same time, there is something we can do. We can fight back. I know David, he inquired of the Lord, shall we pursue and overtake? And the Lord said, yes, pursue and overtake, and what has been taken from you shall be restored. So I believe there is still hope. These people are liars. They do not like confrontation. They can say what they like, but if you look at them the wrong way, they scream harassment. It happened on the streets. I remember then it happened. They would scream, they would run to the police, she is harassing me. They would call people Holocaust survivors Nazis. That was okay. But if we just answered back, they would scream harassment. They become untouchable, unchallengeable. But we've got to get into the ring, and if we get into the ring, we'll win. But if we don't, they'll win by default, and that cannot be allowed to happen.
Absolutely. And Benjamin, I mean, having done quite a lot of work in Europe now, particularly in Brussels, you start to see once again the rise of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's reaching proportions of frightening, absolutely frightening proportions now that, for example, in Denmark, the Jewish community cannot actually wear anything visibly Jewish, like a yarmulke on their heads, or wear a prayer shawl and be identified as Jewish because of fear of attack. There's attacks on, I think even in France alone, has got the rates of anti-Semitism has gone up by 58%. Belgium, it's 30%. And in Britain, anti-Semitic reports for 2012 were the third highest on record. And surely, we have to get to grips with this, the government and society. What are the dangers if our government does not get to grips with this, our society doesn't get to grips, we tolerate anti-Semitism? What is the future for this society?
Throughout history, those who were fighting anti-Semitism, for example, in 19th and beginning of 20th century, the eve of what became the Second World War and the Holocaust, the main argument was that anti-Semitism will consume Europe more than it would actually consume the Jewish people. The Jewish people have survived since the beginning of times, and we shall prevail. But Europe was in ruins in the end of the Second World War, which initiated by blind hate, ignored by others. All it takes for evil to prevail is a few good men to do nothing about it. And when British leaders, when other leaders have seen the hate rising in Europe, it was convenient to ignore it. It made sense to them. There was subtle anti-Semitism, so it's not so bad. They think that most of them live to regret the day. And I think European society, more than any other society, will suffer from allowing blind hate to rise its head in its midst again.
Philip, we're down to less than 2 minutes before the end of the programme. So isn't it important, really, that Christians who have an understanding and love for Israel actually go beyond a theological understanding of Israel and follow your lead and example of standing with Israel and the Jewish people?
As I say, it is so worth it. It's the only worthwhile thing in the world is standing with them. I don't say I support Israel. Israel supports us. It's a subtle difference, but it makes the difference. And yes, something has to be done. What those who hate Israel, they do, they make contact, but they connect. Unfortunately, we do not. We make contact, but we don't connect. So I think it is important because there are people out there with different gifts. If I had it all, you wouldn't like me anyway, but if I had it all, I just couldn't do it. But I don't have it all. I'm very limited. What I do, I do. But there are people out there who are journalists, who are lawyers, who are workers, who are organisers, who are encouragers. We must, as it were, make contact, but once we make contact, we must connect, we must link and do something. Because if we don't, believe you me, we'll be swamped, because they are doing something. They are in the ring. And what I say is get into the ring and confront.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you so much for being part of the Middle East report today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Again, Benjamin. And I just want to thank you all for watching today's programme. You can see from this programme today the lies and the accusations made against Israel by groups like the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions. And it's important as Christians that we stand up and that we counter these lies and accusations against Israel and against the Jewish people, which is demonising them and is leading to an increase in anti-Semitism across Europe. And it's time that we made a stand for them in Jesus' name. And thank you for watching.
שלום וכי אדבר